Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Ren, CEO of MedLink Global, and very excited to start our new webinar series with Dr. Mark Blais, our Chief Assessment Architect and one of the nation's leading experts in clinical psychology and assessment. He's here to walk us through the journey of developing MaiNDS, our three-step next generation diagnostic tool, and how it can really bring value to today's modern psychiatric practices. Good morning, Dr. Mark Blais, and can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how we even start the whole process of developing MaiNDS?
Yes. So thank you for the introduction, Ran. As you said, I'm a clinical psychologist. My area of interest since graduate school has been clinical assessment, actually applying tests with patients, but also making tests and understanding models of psychopathology. And it's really that background that I'm bringing to MedLink to join this exciting process of creating the next level or next generation of assessment tools.
Thank you so much. So let me share the slide.
Today's presentation is going to focus on the core of our new assessment system, which is a multi-level transdiagnostic inventory of psychopathology, or MTIP. I'm going to walk you through its development and its validation and why I think it provides a more efficient, effective, and comprehensive assessment. Next slide, please. What got us here? Well, I actually started training in the mid-'80s. So ever since I was in training, the Psychiatric Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, better known as the DSM, has dominated the field. It's required by clinicians to be reimbursed from insurances. It has been required in grants to get funding for research. Publications almost exclusively have to include some kind of DSM diagnosis. And across all mental health disciplines, social work, master's level therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, everybody has to understand the DSM, and it's part of the licensing exams. So what does it say in the DSM about psychiatric disorders? Well, it's based on a categorical or a medical model, which is understandable. Psychiatry is a branch of medicine, but it defines mental illness as distinct entities. So therefore, depression and anxiety are considered distinct disorders, even though they occur together with incredible commonality. These disorders should have distinct boundaries. They should separate from each other. And given that they're distinct, they should also have unique etiology. So the treatment for one disorder should not necessarily be effective for the other disorder. That will lead us to specific treatments. In the end, what this system does is it focuses on trying to identify specific single categorical disorders. It hasn't all been bad. In fact, the DSM was a substantial improvement over the previous systems that had been used, which had really been more local systems. It provided a common language for researchers and clinicians. So a researcher studying depression in Massachusetts could know that they were studying the same form of depression as somebody in California. And when clinicians talked about depressed patients, they could pretty much assume that other people knew what the language they were using, what that kind of depression was. And in addition, that clarity brought better reliability. When reliability improved, it really energized psychopathology research. Lots more studies were being done, and they were being done in different ways. And over time, the research identified fairly significant problems with the DSM system. One of the more prominent is the high comorbidity, that patients have multiple disorders, not single disorders. And there's heterogeneity, that a patient with the same disorder, like borderline personality disorder, might only have one or two symptoms in common with another patient that has borderline personality disorders. And one of my pet peeves is arbitrary diagnostic thresholds, that if you don't have 5 out of 8 or 9 criteria, you don't have the disorder if you only have 4. So those were some of the problems that accumulated with the growing body of research. With this research developing, new perspectives began to emerge. And for me, the seminal paper was by Bob Kruger in 1999, which demonstrated that 10 of the common psychiatric disorders could be reorganized into 2 broad dimensions of psychopathology: internalizing and externalizing. This sparked more work, similar work, but with a broader range of disorders. And from that, we found 3 core dimensions: internalizing, externalizing, and reality impairing. The reality impairing dimension captured the more severe disorders like schizophrenia and paranoia and manic bipolar illness. These core dimensions have been very widely replicated using diverse samples, different types of measures, disorders, symptoms, test scales, and different research methodologies like cross-sectional or longitudinal. Dimensional models start with traditional DSM disorders or symptoms, but then reorganize them into what's called a multi-level transdiagnostic structure. And here's an example of this multi-level transdiagnostic structure. And this is from a paper by Aiden Wright in 2012. At each level, information is organized into bigger chunks. So at the bottom level, symptoms, these are the smallest things that we measure, the most narrow things we measure. Symptoms then get organized at the next level into disorders. This is what we recognize from the DSM. But these disorders themselves are interrelated, and they then get reorganized into higher level dimensions. And that's the transdiagnostic dimensions: internalizing, externalizing, and thought impairing. Next slide. And this form of thinking, this transdiagnostic dimensional thinking, has been around for a long time in child psychiatry, dating back to the late 1960s. And it's really become increasingly present in research on adult psychopathology. In fact, one type of transdiagnostic model, the alternative model for personality disorders, was introduced in the DSM-5. That model takes the traditional personality disorder maladaptive traits and reorganizes them into 5 broad interrelated dimensions. It's even spread to research, where NIMH has come out with research domain criteria, or RDoCs, which is trying to move investigators, researchers, away from categorical diagnoses so that they study more fundamental or basic neurocognitive networks that underlie all psychiatric disorders. What is the attraction of transdiagnostic models? Well, they're parsimonious, they're coherent, they're comprehensive. So when a patient presents in an outpatient clinic or in your office for the first time, they usually have multiple psychiatric conditions and an array of symptoms. This complicates the diagnostic process, which then makes case formalization difficult and hampers treatment decisions. The transdiagnostic approach is more streamlined because it focuses on core dimensions of psychopathology in a way that's sort of intuitively understood. That makes the transdiagnostic assessment more parsimonious, coherent, and comprehensive because it's going to cover the 3 broad dimensions of psychopathology. And that's easier to apply than a categorical assessment that goes disorder by disorder. And unlike the DSM system, which was developed based on expert consensus, transdiagnostic models are both structurally and empirically valid. What drew me to transdiagnostic assessment is that it's really well matched for what I do, clinical psychological assessment. It's really how psychologists think. We think dimensionally. And because it focuses in a coherent way on 3 core features of psychopathology, it does away with the impact of comorbidity and heterogeneity, and it removes the need for artificial thresholds for a disorder because it's seen as existing on a continuum of severity from normal unhappiness to severe impairing depression. This type of assessment provides an individualized description of psychopathology across a multi-level hierarchy, which can improve our understanding of risk factors, aid in making prognoses, and treatment options. In order for this new thinking to be translated from research into clinical practice, there was a need to create new instruments. The current instruments that we have, the popular psychological inventories, were all made before the emergence of transdiagnostic models. And while they can be reconfigured to a certain degree to match the models, as research from my lab has shown, they weren't developed for true transdiagnostic assessment, and they're not interpreted from a multi-level transdiagnostic point of view. Contemporary psychopathology research is moving beyond the DSM categories, and clinical assessment needs to follow that direction. So this builds an argument for a new type of instrument, one that's grounded in modern empirical models of psychopathology, that's transdiagnostic and hierarchically organized, multi-leveled, but is linked to the DSM for practicality and clinical continuity. With that background, MedLink invited me to be part of this process of creating this next generation assessment system, and that began by developing our multi-level measure of psychopathology. When you begin a test development process, you want to have a conceptual map of where you're going. So this is the map that we use to come up with the final test. What it starts with are 13 clinical scales. So that would be the lowest narrow band of measurement that we have. And the scales cover the three broad dimensions in a fairly balanced order. There are 4 internalizing, 5 externalizing, and 4 thought impairing disorders at this level. The clinical scales then reorganize into the 3 transdiagnostic dimensions or transdiagnostic scales: emotional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation, and thought dysregulation. And those 3 transdiagnostic scales are organized into a single global measure of, and those 3 transdiagnostic scales get reorganized into a single measure of severity, global psychopathology severity. In order to increase clinical utility, other scales, supplemental scales, were added, covering cognitive complaints, eating issues, bodily distress, level of personality, resilience, suicidality. And because it's a self-report test, it's important to include measures that help you verify accuracy and validity. So we have 2 response style scales and 1 validity scale. The test development is a multi-phase project. You're going to have at least 2 phases. The first phase we call the beta phase. This is where we tested out our first item pool of about 135 items. We had subjects drawn from the prolific academic platform, about 300 of them. The sample had a mean age of 43, standard deviation was 14, was 56% female, and unfortunately it was not as diverse as we would like. It was 80% Caucasian. This beta phase focuses on item refinement and scale psychometrics. So we determine internal consistency for all the scales and the initial factor structure at the scale level. And what we found after removing certain items and composing the scales. That internal consistency ranged from 0.94 for anxiety to 0.64 for psychosis. The mean was 0.79 and the median was 0.81. The benchmark here is 0.70. So the vast majority, all but one scale, surpassed the benchmark. We used principal components analysis in this phase to identify the underlying structure of the dimensions, and we found the three factors. And after selecting items and kind of removing some items, we organized the scales. The scales had good to very good internal consistency. Internal consistency ranged from 0.94 for anxiety to 0.64 for psychosis, and had a mean of 0.79 and a median of 0.81. We then employed principal components analysis to find the factor structure of the 13 scales. And what we found were three components that had eigenvalues, though greater than 1, which is simply a rule of thumb for how big a factor should be if you're going to extract it. And the first extracted component was all the emotional distress scales, with loadings from 0.92 for anxiety to 0.84 for traumatic stress. The second component was the behavioral dysregulation scales that loaded from 0.87 for alcohol to 0.42 for anger. And the third was the thought dysregulation scales that had loadings of 0.95 for grandiosity down to 0.49 for manic activation. So what we had at this point was a test that was now ready for standardization and validation. So we went back to the Prolific platform and drew a much more representative sample. We had initially 830 subjects who completed the form, and of those, 640 had no past treatment, and they became the normative sample. The race, much better distribution of race and ethnicity. It's only 66% Caucasian. Mean age, again, is around 40. Standard deviation is 13. And the range was from 18 to 86. And now only 54% were female. We had a good stratification of education, from 16% that had just a high school degree to 15% that had completed college and beyond. The sample was relatively functional, as 74% were either full-time or part-time employed, 5% were retired. Relational status, we had 48% that were married and 41% that were single. And the income, again, was nicely stratified. 23% reported income of less than $30,000 a year, and 20% reported income greater than $100,000 a year. A very nice representative sample.
That's impressive.
With that nice representative sample, we repeated the item level factor analysis and demonstrated that the items did have their strongest associations to the intended scales. In fact, only 13 items had secondary loadings of 0.3 or higher. Therefore, the majority of items are very specific to the scales that they're measuring. The internal consistency, or alpha, ranged from 0.65 to 0.91, with a median of 0.79. Only two scales, antisocial and manic activation, had values below 0.7. However, it's important to realize or to remember that scale length has a strong impact on reliability at the item level. So our scales are brief. They're between 4 and 8 items each. Therefore, we use the Spearman-Brown prophecy formula to estimate the reliability for those two scales if they had 10 items. And under those circumstances, the antisocial scale would have a reliability of 0.79, and the MaiNDS scale's reliability would be up to 0.82. All of the adjusted item to scales correlations were above 0.3, which again is considered the lower boundary. So the item level functioning of the test was quite sound. Now, knowing that the scales had good item and scale level psychometrics, we employed a more rigorous method to determine the underlying factor structure. The data were quite well suited for factor analysis. The KMO was a 0.91. When we used principal axis factoring, we extracted a 3-factor solution that was clear, interpretable, and accounted for almost 50% of the variance. The 13 MTIP scales reproduced the core transdiagnostic dimensions: emotional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation, and thought dysregulations, as we expected, and scale loadings were generally strong, greater than 0.40 for 11 of the 13 scales, and specific. We had only one cross-loading among the scales. We saved the factor scores for analysis that I'll talk about later. So, and this is it. This is the outcome of them. So it's a principal factor analysis with Promax rotation. So that allows the factors to be intercorrelated. The sample is 640, and only loadings equal to or greater than 0.30 are shown. So as you can see, the first factor consists of the emotional dysregulation scales: anxiety, social anxiety, depression, and traumatic stress. The second factor is the behavioral dysregulation scales: antisocial, impulsivity, drug misuse, alcohol misuse, and anger or aggression. And the third factor is the thought impairing scales. So grandiose ideation, psychosis, paranoia, and manic activation. They're all loading on the appropriate scale. And what the one cross-loading that we had was grandiosity had a negative loading on factor 1 of 0.36, which is understandable because all of the emotional dysregulation scales are accompanied by impaired sense of. And that's understandable because the emotional dysregulation scales tend to reduce people's self-esteem. Down at the bottom, or at the lower part, we see the intercorrelations among the factors. Factor 1 and 2 are correlated at 0.56, 1 and 3 at 0.37, and 3 and 2 are correlated at 0.60. This gives us a hint that there's a structure, there's an overarching structure, and that's what's going to be our global measure of severity. So this is what the multi-level transdiagnostic inventory of psychopathology, or MTIP, looks like. At the lowest level, we have the disorders: depression, anxiety, social anxiety, traumatic stress, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, anger, aggression, impulsivity, antisocial, psychosis, paranoia, mania, grandiosity. These then reorganize into the 3 core dimensions: internalizing, externalizing, and thought impairing, which we have called emotional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation, and thought dysregulation. And those 3 dimensions then are reorganized into a global level of severity. So in order to get some initial validity statistics, we use the DSM-5 level 1 cross-cutting symptom measure. Now, this is a screening tool developed by the DSM committee to identify a wide range of psychiatric disorders. Disorders like depression, anger, mania, anxiety, somatic symptoms, suicidality, psychosis, insomnia, memory impairment, OCD, dissociation, personality function, and they lump together all of the drug, alcohol, and other substance use disorders. The psychometric properties of the cross-cutting measure are reasonably well established. We did modify the items a little bit. We set them to the same 5-point rating scale that we use in the MTIP. And so here are our initial validity correlations. The emotional dysregulation scales, our depression scale correlated with the cross-cutting depression at 0.88, anxiety at 0.84, They don't have a social anxiety scale, but social anxiety correlated with anxiety at 0.69, and they don't have a traumatic stress scale, but our traumatic stress scale had its highest correlation at 0.54 with anxiety. And now the behavioral dysregulation scales. Remember, the substance use scale asks 3 questions about alcohol, drug, and tobacco use. And so our alcohol scale correlated with the SUD scale at 0.57, drug scale correlated at 0.50. They do have an anger scale. Our anger scale correlated with theirs, 0.58. They don't have an impulsivity scale, but we use the cognitive scale as its comparator, and it correlated at 0.45 with the cognitive scale. Antisocial really is not represented in the screener, but it did have its highest correlation to substance use, which is a known comorbid condition with antisocial behavior. And here are the thought dysregulation scales. So our psychosis scale and the cross-cutting measure scale correlated at 0.83. They don't have a paranoia scale, but our paranoia scale had its highest correlation with psychosis, 0.42. They do have a mania scale. Our scale correlated with that at 0.71. And they don't have a grandiosity scale, and there are no strong correlations for that scale across these items, these measures. Now, remember back to when I said we saved the factor scores. What I want to use those to do is to see how well our transdiagnostic core dimensions reflect the underlying factors. So we correlated the transdiagnostic emotional distress factor scale with its factor. The correlation was 0.98. The behavioral dysregulation core scale correlated at 0.95 with its second factor. And the thought dysregulation core scale correlated again at 0.95 with the third factor. So our core dimensional transdiagnostic scales are a strong reflection of the underlying structure of the test. In addition to the clinical scales, we were able to match some of our supplemental scales to the DSM cross-cutting measure. So our suicide ideation scale correlated at 0.57 with theirs, but theirs is a single question. Our cognitive concern scales correlated at 0.64 with their cognitive concern scales. The somatic symptom scale, or what we call body distress, correlated at 0.72 with their somatic scale, and the level of personality scales correlated at 0.82. In addition to just being able to represent or capture aspects of the DSM disorders, it's also important to know if these scales will differentiate clinical from non-clinical subjects. Our first effort to do this, which is called clinical utility, was to look at the mean scores of those individuals who reported no history of mental health treatment. That's the 640 in the normative sample, and 182 subjects that we collected at the same time who reported a past history of mental health treatment. We used statistical tests to see if there were mean differences, but more importantly, we obtained effect size measures, or Cohen's d, to be able to demonstrate the magnitude of the difference. So here we see the group differentiation, the mean difference between the groups. Now remember, the no treatment group is our 164 standardization sample, and we're comparing it to the people who identified as having past treatment. That's 182 subjects. The most important measure is going to be effect size. Effect sizes show the magnitude of the difference. A small effect size is between 0.2 and 0.49. A medium effect size is 0.5 to 0.79, and a large effect size is 0.8 and up. And as you can see, all the scales except grandiosity were statistically different between the past treatment group and the no treatment group, and most of the effect sizes were in the medium to large range. This is true also for the transdiagnostic scales. So the past treatment group scored significantly higher on all of the scales except grandiosity. The effect sizes ranged from 0.10 to 0.14. Depression, anxiety, traumatic stress, the emotional dysregulation scales, and the global scale all had large effect sizes. Social, anxiety, anger, impulsivity, mania had moderate effect sizes, and psychosis, antisocial, alcohol, drug, behavioral dysregulation, and thought dysregulation had smaller effect sizes. So just to sort of overcap here in the discussion, the psychometrics and concurrent validity, the new MTIP inventory evidence solid item to scale psychometrics across 2 independent samples. And that's important. We developed it and validated it in different samples. The structure of the test also replicated across the samples and was a good reflection of the transdiagnostic core trans. The factor structure also replicated across the two samples. The factor structure also replicated across 2 samples, evidencing the core transdiagnostic dimensions. Concurrent validity was supported, with most scales having correlations of 0.5 or greater with their DSM target scales, and on average, convergent correlations were much higher than divergent correlations, showing that the correlations were more specific to the intended scale than to other scales. And as we just talked about clinical utility, 13 of the clinical scales differentiated a past treatment group from a no treatment group. 7 scales had effect sizes in the moderate to large range. All 3 of the transdiagnostic scales differentiated the past treatment group from the no treatment group. And it's important to consider that using a past treatment sample likely underestimates the clinical utility of the MTIP when it's put in clinical practice with patients currently experiencing psychiatric difficulties. Overall, the MTIP provides a sound assessment of 13 traditional DSM constructs while capturing the primary transdiagnostic core dimensions of psychopathology. The supplemental scales that have been developed and ones that are in the pipeline help refine and individualize treatment planning. The correspondence of our scales with DSM disorders provides important clinical continuity, while its alignment with contemporary transdiagnostic models allows for the integration of new discoveries, insights, and advances in clinical practice. And this is where we start to build the next generation psychological assessment system. The MPIT is aligned with the DSM, but it reimagines them in an innovative. The MTIP reimagines traditional DSM disorders in an innovative and clinically relevant manner. And what is going to make the MedLink assessment next generation is the integration of AI. At MedLink, we are pairing the MTIP with an agent that's been trained to review, understand, and explore the profile with the patient. The agent's review clarifies and personalizes the findings. The MPIT profile and AI review are integrated into a comprehensive report, providing individualized, contextualized information to support diagnosis and clinical decision-making. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Dr. Blais, for this detailed and insightful walkthrough. And thank you all for our audience joining us today. This session is not only for mental health professionals, but also for all the medical professionals whose patient group have some overlap of mental health symptoms with psych patients. If you like to try MaiNDS in your clinic or explore how it works, or integrate with your workflow, feel free to schedule a demo with us. We truly believe this is the second generation psychopathology assessment, and to help you do diagnostic better, we are very excited to partner